There are a lot of opinions surrounding whether or not you should get an editor for your indie publication, but I think the root of this all is people's confusion on what counts as editing. My name is Taylor Rose, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about everything reading and writing. So the hot topic these last few weeks has been Audra Winter, an indie author who received 6,000 pre-orders for her book, The Age of Scorpius, but unfortunately, once the book was actually in people's hands, they weren't very happy, and the 1- and 2-star reviews started pouring in. Audra herself admits that while she did hire several editors for her book, she didn't actually pay that much attention to what they said. If you're interested in more details, I do have 2 videos going more in depth on what exactly was happening with Audra Winter. It's a really unfortunate set of circumstances. I definitely feel for her, but it's brought up an interesting conversation. Most of the people commenting on Audra's posts are complaining that she didn't have an editor. There are some typos, there are misused words, there's really redundant, overused phrasing. I've only read the first 2 chapters from the sample posted on her Patreon, so I can't say whether or not it's believable that she did have a developmental editor. But somehow, while TikTok is foaming at the mouth over you need to get your book edited, Threads doesn't seem to have received that memo. I'm gonna go ahead and say that I did censor these images because I don't necessarily think there's one side or the other for this debate. I didn't really want to call anyone out specifically. I kind of think that there's just a miscommunication in what exactly people are talking about. This is the post that started all the discourse I've personally seen on whether or not indie authors need editing. So Green posted, "Stop gatekeeping publishing for indie authors. I'm tired of this rhetoric that indies shouldn't publish their work or that their work doesn't deserve support if they can't afford to fork out tens of thousands of dollars for edits/art/marketing, etc. In this economy, Susan, between cover art, copyright, marketing, and being able to afford to eat, look, I get it. Having an editor to polish up your book is helpful, but I, and many other indies, can't afford $3,000+ for a good editor, and I'll be damned if I let that stop me. I'd rather put that money into legally protecting my work first. Having polished work won't mean shit if it gets stolen. So if you're going to push this, people are not going to read your shoddy book. Shit at me. Leave my page, block me if you have to. We don't have room or time for that energy over here." And I agree with her. Nice cover art helps, but it's not 100% mandatory. Marketing also, you can mostly do for free now. Obviously, like paid ads for Amazon, etc., popping up on Facebook and stuff. That obviously costs money, but a lot of, at least it seems to me that a lot of authors now are just building up a social media presence, talking to people like a normal person and earning their fans that way. You don't need tons of art to get people to like your book. So I agree that a lot of the things people say you need to be successful in writing aren't necessarily true, but I'm going to have to kindly disagree on the editing front because we've seen in real time what happens when you don't let anyone look at your work who knows what they're talking about, or you do let them look and then you don't accept any of their advice. So a big part of this conversation has been Blue over here. Blue apparently commented a few times on Green's original post and was blocked from interacting with anyone on the thread. Blue retweeted a photo of Green's post and said the following: "I hate it here. I don't want to live in an indie publishing landscape where simply telling an author to invest in basic editing and making sure they are putting out the best quality product they can before charging money for it is dismissed as gatekeeping. Simply put, this is why some people don't respect indie authors, and it's not going to get better until we get rid of this mentality. A trad publisher who stopped editing the books they put out would go out of business in a week." I'm going to be honest, I agree with her. I take a lot of chances on books because I do subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, but if I had to go pay individually for each book, if I see in the first few pages that there are tons of errors or a lot of kind of like logical inconsistencies, I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to finish it. You know, it is not worth me spending $20+ for something I can tell that there was clearly never a final review of this product, which may sound harsh, but there are hundreds of thousands of books available online. If your book doesn't put its best foot forward in the first few pages, people are going to start reading it and then say, nah, not worth my time, not worth my money. Blue continues, update, she and several other people on the thread blocked me after accusing me of bullying them and being beyond rude, simply for calmly replying to their public take and pointing out how poorly they are coming off in representing indies. Please don't let this represent the next generation of authors. I weep for all of us if so. So if we take a look at the conversation that Blue had with Green, we can see that Green responded to her, where did I say in any of my posts that I don't need or want one? Please show me. I don't know any writer who would turn one down if they could afford it. I do not have the funds for an editor, plain and simple. If I did, I wouldn't be giving my opinion on this discourse. Blue tried to respond, I'm sorry, honey, but no, that's not how it works. Yes, editors are expensive. Yes, not everyone can afford them. But self-publishing, assuming you're charging money for your book, is a business like any other. If you can't afford to invest in the baseline expense of editing, you can't afford to be in business yet. You get a loan, a Kickstarter, or just save up. However, her reply failed to upload because at this point, Green had blocked Blue. Green responded, I'm assuming to a different comment. Wow, bashing me more? Thanks. This behavior absolutely makes me want to learn more about my craft in publishing. I also like how this was a general take on what I'm seeing everywhere, and you took it personally. And you weren't just sharing information, you were being beyond rude. I was willing to listen, but you just want to be a bully. Get off my feed. So if we go back to Blue's post, she had quite a few people responding. I have colored them all yellow, but they are different people. The first response says, there's such a weird sense of entitlement. If indie publishing is too expensive, go trad. If you can't get an agent or sell your manuscript to a trad publisher, maybe it's not good enough. Being published is not an inalienable right. Anyone can throw 90 to 120,000 words together. Just because someone goes to all that effort doesn't make them a good writer, and putting out a mediocre book is going to cost you readers in the long run. Because if someone buys it and it's weak, they're probably not buying the next one. I think this applies to any author, whether or not they're indie published or trad published. For example, I really loved the Six of Crows duology. I decided to go read everything else Leigh Bardugo had published at the time, which was her Shadow and Bone Grishaverse series, which I thought was terrible. It was a trilogy when honestly the plot was one book at most. And personally, I didn't really vibe with the tropes surrounding the main character, but I read the trilogy, I read the short stories for it, I didn't like it, and I have not read anything written by Leigh Bardugo since. It sounds harsh. I'm sure her other books are probably better than Shadow and Bone, but having had that negative experience, I choose to look elsewhere. Another response says, I agree honestly, editing is expensive, and I'm not saying everyone can or should pay for an experienced Big Five editor who charges thousands, but there are critique groups, new editors breaking into the scene with lower rates, and I paid for my editor with a payment plan to make it more affordable. I have complete respect for how tough things are economically for people, but the truth is, everyone needs an editor, bottom line. It's impossible to catch it all yourself. And I think if you're trying to catch it all yourself, you need such a long amount of time between when you wrote something and when you're going to go edit it, basically so your brain doesn't remember writing it. That's several months of waiting so that you have a fresh set of your own eyes to look at what you've written, unfortunately. Oh, that's funny. So that third response commented again, I'm going to leave in that typo of a second impossible instead of a 2, just to drive home my point. A fourth person responded, I see it this way. I'm putting out a product. If people purchase and aren't satisfied, they won't buy my next book, nor will they read my backlist. If authors want to put out substandard work, readers will stop buying them. And Blue responds, exactly. And that's what I've been trying to tell people with this mindset, is that if they want any shot at a lasting career, they cannot churn out unedited rubbish and expect readers to keep giving them chances, because readers have too many other options of where to spend their money in a saturated market. I'm trying to help, but then I get accused of bullying and stifling their creativity. One person even said, publish now, edit later. WTF? This is bizarro world. I can't tell you the number of books I've downloaded on Kindle Unlimited, read 5 pages, and then returned them because it was clear no one but the author had looked at it, probably ever. Another person started a thread where they said, an imperfect book is better than no book. In terms of the book existing or not, yes. In terms of publishing for sale, no. You get one shot to make an impression on readers who are strangers. One. If you don't do the bare minimum of self-editing, betas, revisions, and proofreading, even by barter, your book will make a bad impression, and that's not a good platform to build a career on. Look at what's happening to Audra Winter, and she did spend money / hire an editor that she then admitted she didn't really listen to. I personally blame influencer, MLM, and side hustle culture for this. No one can simply enjoy sharing their creativity. Everything needs to be monetized. I'd love to make my writing a career, earning enough to live off, but I mostly want my stories out there. Before I worked full-time, I shared my stories on AO3, Fiction Press, and Wattpad. And sadly, this kind of "it's too expensive so I'll skip it" thinking is predominantly why indie publishing is seen as inferior quality. Blue responds with the 100 emoji. And then this person responded, I totally understand why writers feel the inclination to publish their work for profit, especially in this economy. It feels like we can't really take the time to work for free, even if it's our passion. But that being said, it's kind of hypocritical to expect readers to spend their money that they worked hard to earn when you aren't, especially when you're competing with other writers. And no, not everyone has endless funds. They just prioritize and research. Like my example with Kindle Unlimited, there are so many books. There are so many books there. You will never run out. So Red went ahead and made their own post as well. I wasn't going to weigh in, told myself not to. I'm going to weigh in. This editing conversation is ableist. Specifically, everyone's saying you should wait to release your book entirely until you can afford a professional editor. Not everyone can afford an editor. People should be able to do what they love, even if they don't have the money to reach your standards. Read established indie authors or TradPub if you want perfect editing. A lot of us are poor and just want to tell good stories. And I will say, at least for Blue, I did not find any comments where Blue specifically said you need to hire a professional editor, just that you needed basic editing done by somebody else that isn't you. So Blue responded, no one ever said you can't do what you love or tell good stories. You don't need anyone's permission to write. But when you start asking people to pay money for your product, you're running a business at this point and you need to hold yourself to a higher standard. And that includes offering them an edited, professionally produced, typo-free book. No exceptions, this isn't complicated. Especially if you aren't offering your book on something like Kindle Unlimited. Again, that's the reason I'm able to try so many different books and different authors. But if they weren't on Kindle Unlimited, I'm not throwing away $10 on your ebook that I can't even read a sample for most of the time. Blue continues, you don't need the most expensive name brand editor in the world, but you do need editing. Red responds, editing is expensive at any standard if you have nothing. Mistakes happen. I found typos in tried published works. People pay money for all types of imperfect things. Maybe this is your sign to take pride in the level of care that you give your work. It sounds commendable. Or that it will be okay and people will understand when you inevitably make a mistake. This page is not a safe space for you to shit on those who can't afford your standards and never will be. Interesting take. This kind of reminds me of when I was applying to work for the JET program when I graduated college. It's a program that puts native English speakers into public schools in Japan to expose them to native English and foreigners. Japan is like 98% homogenous, basically. I was an English major. I reviewed my essay. I had my best friend, who was also an English major, review my essay. I had my mom, she was an elementary school teacher and a reading specialist for around 25 years. And I had my older sister. She doesn't really have a reading, writing background, but she does have a master's in psychology. Obviously, there was no way I was going to pay a professional editor for my job application, but I'm just saying you can use what you have. Meanwhile, my husband also applied to JET. He unfortunately didn't get in, and I found out years later when we started dating that he didn't have anyone proofread his essay. So he just wrote his essay and then submitted it. Consequently, was not accepted to a program with, at the time, it was like a 15% acceptance rate. Another response said, I say this with much love. Indie authors, hire an editor. But I have an MFA. Great, love that. Hire an editor. But I had beta readers. Top-notch decision. Hire an editor. But I'm an English teacher. Fabulous. Hire an editor. The truth is, everyone needs an editor. An editor will elevate your book. This is not just about your book. Your decision and the resulting quality of your book impacts the confidence readers have in indie authors. Hire an editor. I will say I felt like this comment was a little too strict. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a friend that you know is really good in the language you're writing. That's my caveat. That sounds mean, but clearly that isn't their strength. They probably have a ton of other strengths, and if I needed help in those categories, I would ask them for help. But in terms of English writing, I would find somebody else. I definitely think people who do those first few things probably have a step up over people who don't. It's possible they've done all those things and they're still not great at writing. Green responded, and what if I can't afford it? I'm working with a bare bones budget. Am I supposed to delay releasing my work because I can't afford one? I will note that going to Green's profile, they are basically running a fundraiser trying to raise up money to publish their first book. OP responded, yes, releasing a poor version of your book is a really bad idea. I understand and sympathize, but you aren't going to get the results you want if you don't get an editor. Save up and put out the best book you can. Doesn't your book deserve that? And Green answers, my book absolutely deserves the best treatment. However, in this economy, not everyone has the luxury of just saving up. Editors are expensive, on top of every other cost that indies have to cover themselves. And I have seen a number of people have immense success without editors. I truly think it can be done. I'd be curious to see who they're talking about. So back on Green's original post, someone responded saying, I haven't seen anyone saying that. What I have seen is people saying, do your best with the resources you have. If you can't spend on a professional editor, get as many sets of eyes on your writing as you can, get it as clean as you can before you publish. Indies are publishing all the time for fairly minimal outlays. Green responded, I need to follow those people because do your best with what you have is far better than what I've been seeing. Yellow responded, I saw someone recently post a breakdown of their total publishing costs, but I can't remember who. I'll link it if I can find it. Yes, ideally, you'd get professional services at least on one stage, whether it's dev edits or line copy edits, or a proofread before publishing. But you may know people with those skills who can help or do skill swaps with other writers. Work with what you can. I full-heartedly agree with this. There are a lot of opinions surrounding whether or not you should get an editor for your indie publication, but I think the root of this all is people's confusion on what counts as editing. Technically, there are more types of editing than these three, but these are the three major types of editing. First up, we have proofreading and copy editing. While some people consider them a little different, I think largely they do the same things. They are looking for typos and grammatical errors if you use an article wrong or misconjugated a verb or something, if the tense is changing, things like that. Using English as an example, they're going to be using the correct style of English that you want or that you're using. Obviously, British English is going to follow a different style than American English, Canadian English, Australian English. They have different styles. They really aren't reading for content. You are in there with a magnifying glass. You can see this example here from writershelpingwriters.net. So you can already see the example lines. Capitalization's wrong, spelling's wrong, punctuation's wrong. So that's all they've fixed. They've added commas, they've corrected the capitals, they've moved the punctuation to the right spot, and that's it. They've just zeroed in on punctuation, capitalization, and spelling. Line editing typically happens before copy editing. So they're more concerned with the content and the writing itself. So they might suggest you use different words if maybe you used one that has a connotation that doesn't fit with what you're talking about. They will point out when you are using the same words over and over, when you're being redundant with information or sentence structure. They might point out if there's problems with your logic or the consistency in the story. And personally, I think this is the most important. I see this a lot when I read books and they'll say something that sounds good, but when you think about it, doesn't actually make any sense. For example, I read a book recently where it said, she picked up the neck of the green beer bottle. Obviously, that sentence is suggesting to you the beer bottle's broken. The neck is separate from the beer bottle because she's picking up the neck. Why would they say the neck if they mean the entire bottle? So that sentence should have said, she picked up the green beer bottle by its neck, because in the scene the beer bottle was whole, it was not broken, she was going to fill it up. Again, brings up why are you refilling beer bottles, but that is probably a note that the line editor would put into the document. So if we look at Jenny's example for line editing, and she has put in a few comments. She says, consider using attributions in these lines so the reader can follow more clearly who's talking. Basically, she means there are no dialogue tags. It might confuse readers. Obviously, this example is only 2 lines, but if it were in a page with lots of unlabeled dialogue, your reader's going to be confused on who's actually talking, right? Another of Jenny's notes says, suggest changing to dinner since in paragraph above you say it's 6 p.m., right? Logically, that doesn't make sense. So the result, we have, hey Jill, Dave said, do you want to grab dinner? Sorry, I'm busy. She added a dialogue tag and she adapted the question to be more correct in terms of the entire context of the scene. Next is developmental editing. So this is the type of editing that would happen even before line editing. This is what's going to happen after you've written your story, and the developmental editor is going to be able to read your book and look at it big picture. What is the heart of the storyline? Do all these events make sense happening like this? If there's some sort of mystery, are the clues actually given to the reader? So they're looking for plot holes. They will give you suggestions on maybe the timing of events. They're going to read the full manuscript and then make comments. So looking at Jenny's example for developmental editing, where she makes a few comments. Right? Who is Dave to Jill? We have no idea. Since this is a romantic comedy and this is the moment our main characters first speak to each other, you're missing an opportunity to let the reader into the moment. Because when we just have Dave said, I'm assuming from Jenny's comment that in the preceding paragraphs, there was no mention of Dave. So Dave is just appearing. We don't know who he is. This is the opportunity to give him a good introduction. She makes another comment for Jill's response. She just says, sorry, I'm busy. But it's like, why is Jill reacting this way? How is she actually reacting? So Jenny's comment says, it would add enormously to the impact of this scene if we had a sense of Jill's state of mind. What does she think of this invitation? How does she react? Without this element, the scene doesn't add to the story. Remember that we always want to know a character's response, and that when we see a response that is unexpected or different from what the character's body language is conveying, that lets us see inside the character's head, which is where we want to be. So taking Jenny's comments into account, we have the result. When Jill came out of the locker room, Dave was standing alone on the pool deck. Although he'd joined the team 2 weeks before, he'd never spoken a word to her. She wasn't even sure he knew her name. Hey Jill, he said. I was going to head over to Hamburger Habit. Do you want to grab dinner? Jill had to stop herself from laughing with joy. Sorry, she mumbled. I'm busy. Jenny's examples go on further to talk about using a book coach, which is basically a developmental editor project manager. A developmental editor typically just does 1 round of these edits. They give their recommendations, you can take them or leave them. A book coach would be coming back to see how you've implemented their suggestions. So we can see when the book coach comes back, she makes several comments. Much better. When you continue to work on this scene, you might take this concept. The guy arrives on the team, catches her eye, but doesn't speak to her, and let us see that unfolding over time so that when this moment does happen, we feel how important it is to Jill. We know what the stakes are. So she's suggesting that throughout the previous chapter or chapters, little hints about Jill being interested in Dave are dropped to the reader, instead of just having Dave appear out of nowhere and then Jill acknowledging, oh, he's never spoken to me before. She continues, it's a little unclear why she's laughing. Clarify? And then her next comment, great, we get the sense that there's more to this moment than meets the eye. It would be awesome if we could be let into what's going on. As it is, we feel a little left out. I know it may be hard for you to dig into this moment since it was inspired by real life, but see if you can describe what this moment was really like for Jill, the push and pull of it. Maybe this is something you can think about while you're at the lake house this weekend and then work on the revision when you turn it into me next week. Obviously, that comment is written from the perspective of someone in regular communication with the author during the editing process. And Jenny does go on to provide an example of a second round of revisions. So if you are having your developmental editor do multiple edits with you, or if you do have a book coach, for example, they would continue providing you with input. So we can see in this text, this author has edited what she wrote previously. When Jill came out of the locker room, Alicia was gone, and Dave was standing alone on the pool deck. The plan had been to give Alicia a chance to ask him to dinner, and Jill assumed the scheme had worked. She felt suddenly nervous, as if she was betraying her friend just by standing there. Besides, Dave had never spoken a word to her, and she wasn't even sure he knew her name. Hey Jill, he said. I was going to head over to Hamburger Habit. Do you want to grab dinner? Jill had to stop herself from laughing at the irony of it. She would have loved to go to dinner with the tall, dark-haired newcomer, but she would never do that to Alicia. Sorry, she mumbled. I'm busy. So it's like, finally, we came full circle with this developmental editing. We have more context for the scene. We have a lot more interiority from Jill herself, explaining her reactions and giving a much broader picture of the world in general. So, you know, we have all these different types of editing. And I will say, hopefully your book doesn't look quite like the example before she got to the developmental editing, because that read really as like a skeleton. It felt like a zero draft, like you're just spitting out dialogue you want to have, but nothing else. In the case of a book coach, I could imagine that being acceptable, but editing Taylor here. So I don't think I really expressed the opinion I wanted to the first time I filmed. So personally, I think developmental editing is probably the most important. It is really hard to find someone who will ask you the hard questions, especially among friends and family. For example, I read an arc where crazy stuff was happening, crazy stuff that just took me completely out of the world, especially because this was in a contemporary setting. And it was like stuff that's illegal. And nobody's reacting. Nobody thinks it's weird. The POV character doesn't think it's weird. Like, in real life, someone would have said something, or the POV character would have noticed nobody said anything, if that makes sense. So it's like, yeah, that book really needed a developmental editor to point out, like, hey, these things don't logically make sense. And what got me about this arc was that the editor is the spouse of the author. So it was just really apparent that they didn't want to hurt their spouse's feelings, which I don't blame them. Most people don't want to hurt your feelings if they care about you. I definitely think in every genre there's a type of book that is really cookie cutter, and if that's what you're aiming for, an easy read that has mass appeal, that isn't super deeply complicated, like, sure, you probably don't need a developmental editor. But if you're going for something that has a lot of moving parts, you probably should hire somebody who will look at your story with a critical eye and give you the truth. Versus line editing. Especially so if you are a prolific reader. You know what books in your genre look like because you're reading them, or you've put 3, 6 months, a year between you and having written that part. Otherwise, you're just going to keep looking at it like, oh, this is great, because it's familiar in your brain, and your brain is just going to gloss over it the last 20 times it's looked at that sentence, versus in 6 months, you haven't looked at that sentence at all, your brain's going to be like, oh, wait, that's weird. The proofreading part, I do think probably you could get away with spell check, but the issue is if you're just using spell check, it's not going to pick up on any of the things that a line editor or a developmental editor would be telling you. You do need to vet who you're hiring. There are a lot of scammers online, unfortunately. I'm not going to say it's not better for you to find somebody who isn't related to you, isn't in a relationship with you, probably isn't even your friend. The downfall of using people who are close to you is that they probably don't want to offend you. They're gonna use kid gloves around you, basically. I don't think you probably need a really prestigious professional editor, but I do think you need to find somebody who isn't close to you that will be able to give you honest feedback about the things happening in your book. But how do you feel? Do you think indie published books need editing? How much editing? What kind of editing? Let me know down below in the comments. That's all I have for you. I will see you next time.